Hello, historians. Welcome back to Cocktails and Cliff Notes. I'm your host, Mason, and today we are going beyond a lone rider as we unravel Paul Revere's intricate intelligence network, the precise signals that mobilized the resistance, and the strategic foresight behind his legendary midnight ride. We're going to be dissecting how a coordinated alarm system, not just a horse, ignited the American Revolution. Now, before we get into that, we're going to be making a quick smoothie post workout thing that I have been loving lately. If you do want to skip that, just use the timestamps in the description below to get right into our story. Otherwise, stick with me. Now, I've been really into smoothies lately. I did get a nice new full size blender for the holidays from my sweet uncle, and it has changed everything. My individual smoothie blender, like the NutriBullet type thing, blew up on me the other day trying to crush up a banana. And so let's take this. What we're going to do is we're actually going to start with our chia seeds, trying to layer things in the blender so that they don't blow up my nice new motor is tricky. And chia seeds, I just want you to be aware, they can be really high in calories, but they do make you feel satiated for a long time. There's a lot of good stuff in there, including but not limited to a teensy bit of protein, a little bit of fiber, and some good healthy fats. So let's dump in like quite a bit. I'm not really shy with them because I'm not counting calories right now. Okay, then I want you to dump in a little bit of water. You could also do coconut water if you wanted to. Then let's do our protein. If you've watched my videos, you know I am a vanilla protein gal. I promise I will do some like chocolatey, peanut buttery stuff because I know people like that, but she's never really been my thing. I like vanilla. I'm going to go ahead and add my creatine to this just because I haven't had it today. And I mean, two birds, right? My fruit that I have selected for today is going to be half a banana. And I'm doing some blueberries. I really love blueberries. They're so good for you in every feasible way, I swear. I also freeze everything. My banana is frozen, my blueberries are frozen. That saves me from having to use ice, which means that my smoothie is not diluted. Next thing I'm doing, I'm going to add one of these little drinks into my smoothie. It's just like a proteiny, yogurty drink, and I like the ingredients on this company a lot. That will up our protein quite a bit. Okay, I'm popping the lid on this, and then I'm going to go blend. I didn't bring my actual base to the blender over here, so I'll be right back. And I like to put it in a cold cup, Bucky's cup, just so that it stays nice and cold for a good long minute. And I don't feel like I have to get it down quickly before it turns gross. There we go. How pretty is that? It looks like something from the Cat in the Hat. How nice. So many good ingredients. I love to actually enjoy getting my protein down because sometimes I just don't. Sometimes I do like the water and protein and that's it. And it's fine, but it's also not. It's very gross. I enjoy smoothies. I like to really have a pleasant time trying to be healthy. So join me if you will. And for now, we can just stop talking about our drinks because we are getting into our story. Now, let's just start by acknowledging that Hollywood really does love a lone hero. Everyone does. That whole story of one man, one horse, one midnight dash through sleepy villages, shouting warnings into the dark. And I will admit that it is a very clean image. It's very easy to remember, very poetic, very exciting. It gets, your heart racing, I suppose. And it's very easy to write and film and package and produce and everything else. But the real story of Paul Revere does not begin with a solo ride. It begins with a network. Now, on the eve of April 18th, 1775, Boston was a city under occupation. British soldiers patrolled the streets, warships crowded the harbor, cannons were faced inward, not outward, and the air was very tight with suspicion. General Thomas Gage, he knew that rebellion was coming. The Sons of Liberty knew that the British were watching, and every moment, every whisper carried a lot of risk. Now, this unfortunately was not that Hollywood lone hero moment. This was actually a time for great and precise coordination among people. Now, Paul Revere, he was not just some cowboy that went charging into the night. He was a very skilled silversmith, he was a trusted courier, and he was a central node in a clandestine communication web built by the Sons of Liberty. He was a very active participant in the Sons of Liberty. And if you want more clarity on that, you need to go watch the other video that I just posted about Freemasonry and other secret societies, because the Sons of Liberty, they were very active. They had a lot of action oriented goals. They were going to make things happen and they were going to do it now. And Paul Revere was very, very much involved in that particular group. But as a loose but disciplined resistance, they were a network stretching across all of Massachusetts and many other places. They had lookouts, they had riders, they had contingency plans, they had thought things through, they debated, talked, planned for years. They used taverns, they used churches, they used people's private homes as relay points. They relied on trusted families and prearranged signals, and information moved very quietly, hand to hand, face to face, through a trusted messenger. It was all very hush hush. You can't trust anybody in this particular point in history. Now, the famous lanterns in the Old North Church were not a dramatic flourish. They were actually a backup system. They were a signal to Charlestown in case Revere himself was actually captured on this night. One if by land, two if by sea. You might have heard that before, and we'll come back to it in a minute. But that particular line actually survives today just because it worked so well. And it worked because Boston in 1775 was already a pressure cooker. Boston was kind of the head of a lot of these things. There were a lot of philosophical brains in there, and they were really mulling over ideas. They were trying to come up with solutions. Boston was a full on hub, which is why they were so oppressed with British affliction at this time. It's because that's where everything was really ramping up. British troops had been stationed there since the Boston Tea Party. Now, you remember the Boston Tea Party. I know that you do. Now, curfews at this time, they were very common. This was not a rare occurrence. Searches were routine. Colonists were disarmed while soldiers drilled openly in their streets, and tension simmered between civilians and redcoats, between neighbors and informants, between colonists, between loyalists, and everybody had a different opinion and a slightly different take, and you didn't know who was watching you. So everybody knew that something was coming. There was something on the horizon. We don't know when, we don't know what, we don't know where, but we know that it's coming. So when Gage finally ordered these troops to march toward Concord and seize all colonial weapons and arrest any rebel leaders, the resistance network actually snapped into motion for the first time ever. It was game time. It was go time. Everything just got real. Now, Paul Revere, he was actually one rider among many, and every one of them was very important, but Paul Revere's was especially impressive because his role in this whole thing was precision. It was not bravado, it was actually speed, not spectacle. He knew the roads, he knew the safe houses, he knew the names to trust. Now, this was not a story of one man that just went off in the distance, shouting in the night in an arbitrary direction, trying to get people to wake up. This was actually a story of a community that had prepared for this particular moment and of how secrecy, planning, and cooperation turned the British raid into the opening act of a revolution. Now, once you understand that, the myth itself doesn't necessarily shrink, but it does deepen quite a bit, because revolutions cannot be won by lone riders. They are carried forward by networks, moving quietly, acting together, just ahead of history's spotlight. So, back to that famous line, one if by land, two if by sea. Now, this has become a bit of a historical spell. You say it, and the image appears instantly, if you know what I'm talking about. Lanterns glowing in a church tower, destiny flickering against the night. But the truth is both more practical and much, much more impressive. I say this because the signal from the Old North Church was never meant to alert the entire countryside directly. Lanterns don't travel that far. They were never going to wake sleeping farmers from miles away. Their purpose was much more narrow and much sharper. They were never meant to war on Charlestown, which was just across the Charles River. And if British troops marched out of Boston by land, the lanterns would signal one route. If they crossed the river by boat, they would signal another. That was it. A contingency plan, it was fail safe, it was foolproof. But Paul Revere himself did not actually place the lanterns. That task fell to trusted allies who stayed behind, knowing full well that the British patrols could arrest them if they were caught. Now, Revere's job was movement. He had to be strategic. The lanterns were insurance. Now, insurance mattered because Revere actually fully expected and 100% anticipated being caught and detained. So, this brings us to what really made the warning system work. The alarm spread not because of a single rider, but because of a layered redundancy. Couriers were positioned along these prearranged routes, and they were responsible for waking the next person. Now, taverns and private homes served as these relay points, these stops, these rests, grab a bite to eat, take a breath for a second. Now, riders carried verbal messages to avoid incriminating written evidence. In some cases, coded phrases were used, different wording, ordinary conversation, which carried out extraordinary meaning. Regulars are moving out. The troops are on the move. Nothing that could be easily proven as direct treason if overheard, but everything that needed to be understood by the right ears. You just have to say these little things, and the right person will understand, oh, I better go saddle up my horse. So some riders traveled only a few miles, others doubled back, some were easily and quickly captured. Others slipped through completely and totally unnoticed, and the system didn't rely on perfection, it actually relied on overlap. So the same person might get 3 or 4 knocks on their door and might hear the same message 3 or 4 different times just to make sure that every base was covered. Now, by the time that Paul Revere actually did get detained by British patrol, the message and the warning was already spreading. It was almost like a multi level marketing thing. And Paul went and told his people, they went and told their people, and they went and told their people. So it really didn't do anything to deter the message that was being spread through the colonies, and that was by design. Now, at the center of all this was a man who very rarely gets any kind of spotlight or attention, and this is Dr. Joseph Warren. Now, I hadn't even really heard of Dr. Joseph Warren, maybe in passing here and there, but when I really started looking into him, I was like, dang, he was kind of badass. So Warren, he was actually a physician by trade, i.e. doctor, but by 1775, he was the quiet nerve center of Boston's resistance. He gathered intelligence, he tracked British movements, he coordinated responses with remarkable discipline, and it was Warren that learned of General Gage's plan to march on Concord. It was Dr. Joseph Warren who actually did dispatch Revere and another writer by the name of William Dawes. You might have heard of William Dawes, but he went on a different route. So to maximize the chance that at least one of them would succeed, they rode off in different directions and had different responsibilities of telling different people, just in case one or both of them were intercepted at a certain point. Now, Warren understood something very, very crucial, and that's that information loses value the longer it's delayed. So his goal wasn't necessarily the drama, it was speed and it was certainty, it was precision. And Warren paid for his commitment. Just 2 months later, at the Battle of Bunker Hill, he actually refused a command role and he fought as a volunteer. He did end up falling during the final assault, and when the British identified his body, they actually mutilated it, which was a brutal signal of how dangerous they believed him to be. He was kind of a badass. Like, he was a badass, you guys. Now, this was not an accident of history. It was full on recognition. The midnight warning worked because it wasn't heroic. It was actually very professional. It was well planned. It relied on prearranged signals, trusted couriers, multiple routes, local knowledge, and leadership that understood intelligence is a collective effort. Paul Revere, he obviously mattered deeply. So did William Dawes. So did the men who hung the lanterns, saddled the horses, opened the doors in the dead of night. They were all on the same page and they all knew what was going on. But the real achievement wasn't the ride. This was a resistance network mature enough to turn British secrecy against itself. Now, when the first shots fired the next morning, the colonies were not caught off guard. They were already awake. They were up and running. That, more than any poem or painting, is what made April 19th, 1775 the beginning of a revolution. In intelligence work, timing is everything. It is not a detail, it is everything. So on the night of April 18th, 1775, the British objective was precise. General Thomas Gage did not order a broad crackdown, he ordered a very surgical strike. Now, British regulars were to march quietly to Concord, seize hidden military supplies, and arrest rebel leaders if they could not be found. That was the mission. The goal was speed and surprise. No speeches, no warnings. In the rebellion before it could actually start. If the colonists were caught sleeping, the resistance would fracture, but secrecy cut both ways. Everybody had a dog in that fight. The Sons of Liberty had eyes literally everywhere. Word reached Joseph Warren that the troops were moving, not days ahead, but hours. He had just a little bit of time. That narrow window mattered very much. A warning sent a little bit too early could raise suspicion, but a warning sent a little bit too late would be entirely useless. So Revere and the network had to move in the space between certainty and silence. Now, Paul Revere's path that night was not just some romantic wandering around effort to try to tell as many people as possible. It was designed, and it was designed very carefully. Once ferried across the Charles River, he rode through Charlestown, he went through Medford, and then, I'm going to say this wrong, Minatomi, basically just towns that were thick with militia readiness. And these were not random villages, these were nodes. Each stop was chosen because someone trusted lived there, someone who knew the next rider, someone who could wake others without raising alarm. And Revere did not run through the streets shouting. He knocked, he whispered, he confirmed and sent that person on to do their duty. So at each critical point, the warning fractured outward. Again, multi-level marketing. They told one person and that person told the next person. The message was carried by fresh riders who knew their roads the best. Now, this wasn't necessarily a relay race with a single baton. It was more like a branching tree. And that mattered because Revere never actually reached Concord. He was captured near Lincoln by a British patrol. He was questioned at gunpoint and he was briefly held. By the time they released him, his mission was already out into the world. It was underway. It was technically complete. Now, at dawn, the church bells were ringing, but this was not in the name of worship. This was a warning. Drums sounded, militia captains issued their orders, farmers reached for their muskets that had been cleaned and hidden away, tucked behind a bed frame for months. And these men were not improvising. This was not a shock to anybody in the colonies. They had drilled for this moment. They had agreed on rendezvous points. They knew who was responsible for what task. So when British troops arrived at Lexington Green, at sunrise, they did not find sleeping villages. They found a line of armed men. Now, the first shots, whoever fired those, we still don't know. We will never know. Those shots shattered the illusion of control. And as the British pushed on towards Concord, they discovered that most of the stored ammunition had already been moved or hidden or was being used. Now, this mission, the British mission, technically had failed. And as the British began to march back to Boston, the alarm system reached its final phase. Minutemen poured in from surrounding towns, firing from behind trees, stone walls, and hills. What had begun as a disciplined march became a running battle. By the time the Redcoats reached the safety of British lines, they were bloodied, they were exhausted, and they were shocked at what just happened. Not by superior numbers, not by superior weapons, definitely not by superior fighting styles or battlefield strategy, but by the fact that they were prepared at all. The Midnight Ride did not cause the revolution. It totally revealed it, though. The colonies did not rise because of a single warning. They rose because they had been waiting. They had been organizing quietly, they had been training patiently, and trusted a system built for exactly this moment. Timing turned intelligence into mobilization. Mobilization turned resistance into battle, and battle turned a political crisis into open war. And by the time the sun set on April 19th, 1775, there was absolutely no turning back. The revolution was no longer a conversation whispered in taverns and letters. The revolution was echoing across the countryside. Musket fire marking the moment when preparation met history. And can you even imagine if you've been hearing about this for months, years, and you're just like, oh my gosh, I'm out here churning some butter, and you hear that it's actually really happening? I feel like it would be such a shock because I don't know. I just feel like in conversations that I hear about modern times, I'm like, surely nothing's ever going to come from that. I think it would be shocking to hear that the revolution had actually began and that it wasn't just a theory in a tavern anymore. I think I would be like, holy hell. And then I don't know what I do after that. I'd probably be like, I'm gonna go hide. Canada looks cool. Now, I do want to say that when the smoke cleared and the wounded were counted, April 19th, 1775 became more than a clash at Lexington and Concord. It became a full on proof of concept. The colonies had tested something that night, not just their willingness to fight, but their ability to coordinate and come together. What worked wasn't necessarily brute force, it wasn't formal command, it was information moving faster than authority. And that particular lesson stuck. Throughout the Revolutionary War, the Patriots leaned heavily on the same principles that made the Midnight Alarm so successful. They built local intelligence networks rather than centralized ones, and communities gathered information on troop movements, supply routes, and loyalist activity. Messages traveled through trusted individuals instead of official channels. So Washington himself, he actually absorbed this lesson really early, and later in the war, he would rely on organized espionage rings like the Culper ring. They used coded letters, they used invisible ink, they used compartmentalized knowledge. Now, this was the same technique rooted in the same logic that guided Revere's ride. Now, the revolutionists learned very early that secrecy does not come through all these acts of grandeur or exciting things going on. It's very quiet and it comes through discipline. And luckily, discipline can be taught. So, for every name that history remembers, there are dozens that it didn't. There are many men who left their warm beds that night to saddle horses. There are women who opened their doors at midnight without hesitation. There are families who hid weapons for months, passed messages, or fed exhausted riders before sending them on again. They were not professional soldiers. They were blacksmiths, they were farmers, they were shopkeepers, they were innkeepers. Their participation was not coerced. It was completely chosen. It was very much voluntary. They were all in on the same mission. And what made this network extraordinary was not necessarily bravery alone. It was the fact that they had trusted people that they could rely on, that they could lean on, and that they knew were safe to go to. So each person believed the next rider would do their part. They had to trust that. And each took a risk knowing that there would be no medals, there would be no monuments, and no recognition. The revolution did not yet belong to the generals, it belonged to the neighbors, it belonged to the friends. Again, the farmers, the fathers, the shopkeepers, the innkeeper, the guy up the street running the general store. Now, after all of this was said and done, I think that the most lasting impact of that night was psychological. For the first time, colonists across towns and regions acted in unison, not because there was a distant authority or government or something that you feared hanging over your head telling you that you had to do something. They were not under the command of anybody. They were just themselves. They recognized other people just like them to do their part the same as they did because they believed in something that was, in fact, bigger than the individual. Now, the alarm did not stop at Concord. It rippled out all the way through Massachusetts and beyond, carrying a message more powerful than any proclamation. This was no longer Boston's problem. This was everyone's problem, and they all had to come together now. They had to start making some decisions and having some public conversations that were going to be tough to agree upon, but had to be done. Now, within days, militia units from other colonies began moving. Communication networks expanded further than they had even planned, and committees of correspondence intensified their effort. What had once been resistance became mobilization. Unity was not declared, it was practiced. The events sounding the midnight alarm set a precedent that would define the Revolutionary War. Decentralized organization, shared responsibility, civilian participation, information as power. And these principles allowed a loosely connected collection of colonies to function as something resembling a nation long before one officially existed. The revolution did not succeed because it was inevitable. It succeeded because ordinary people learned how to act together quietly, quickly, and decisively when the moment finally arrived. And once that lesson was learned, it could not be unlearned. The British arrived in Lexington believing they could end a rebellion with a single march. They left having discovered something far more dangerous. They found a population that knew how to communicate, coordinate, and stand together, not as subjects, but as people becoming a country. The midnight ride serves in memory as a blur of hooves and urgency, a lone rider racing the darkness. But history, when you listen a little bit more closely, tells a much smarter story with much more intricate detail and many, many important people coming together as one. This is not a heroic sprint. It was a masterclass in intelligence. Signals were prearranged, Routes were chosen with intent, messages were verified, not assumed. Redundancy was built in so no single failure could ruin the mission. Just because Revere did get captured, the entire system didn't collapse. It adapted and it continued onward. This was what real coordination looks like, not spectacle, preparation. And that lesson has not aged a single day. In the late 18th century, information moved by lantern light and whispered knocks. Today, it travels at the speed of a single click, but the stakes are greatly the same. Accurate information still shapes outcomes. Bad intelligence can lead to disaster. Trustworthy networks still outperform loud ones, and always will. Whether it's journalism, whether it's science, emergency response, or civic movements, the same rule still applies. The strongest systems are not the flashiest, but definitely the most reliable. The Midnight Ride reminds us that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it spreads quietly, spreads unilaterally, and changes everything before anybody realizes what's happening. So I want you to raise a glass, not just to Paul Revere, but to the many unseen, unrecognized riders who took the message further and faster than any poem could follow. To the women who opened their doors at impossible hours, to the families who hid supplies without knowing if they were going to be discovered, and to the neighbors who trusted each other enough to act. These were the unseen architects of the American Revolution. They didn't just warn a countryside. They proved that a network of ordinary people bound by trust and a shared purpose could outmaneuver an empire. And that might be the most revolutionary idea of all. Cheers.